on and talk to me. If you would, please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your expertise.
Yeah, my name is David Dowling. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. And my field is media communication and culture with an emphasis on narrative journalism from print to the digital age. And most recently, I have a book coming out on podcast journalism. It's coming out in January with Columbia University Press. And basically, I talk about the promise and perils of this new audio medium for journalism that's really been revolutionized since the publication of Serial in 2014 for a long-form documentary kind of storytelling, and now all the way with daily news with the New York Times, The Daily, and Michael Barbaro, as well as a lot of intellectual content too that's coming out in like science journalism, et cetera, just like your podcast, this very one here. So yeah, so that's my field, that's my area of expertise.
So the conversation I want to have with you is pretty simple, actually, in premise. I want to talk about stories and why we communicate through stories, why they're good for communicating ideas, and then how we do it through different media. And I guess the reason it kind of struck me, and I started finding YouTube channels where they would talk about very popular stories, movies, things like that, and they would dissect it in terms of there's philosophy channels on YouTube, and they talk about the philosophy of superheroes. They talk about the psychology of these heroes. They talk about what the uniforms say, the fashion, all these things. This is amazing how much information that we're learning implicitly through watching these stories, through taking in these narratives. And I just figured somebody has studied these things and they really understand why, like what's going on in terms of this information processing and dissemination.
So the most basic kind of building blocks for understanding narrative begin with being able to sort it vis-a-vis academic approach. Okay, so typically there are two approaches. One is a historical or empirical approach, where you're looking at sort of the long view of content of these stories and the people who are producing them and consuming them. And then there's the cognitive approach, right? Where you're not really looking at just the content empirically, but you're looking at the processing of that content cognitively, right? How do people understand it? How do they make sense of it? On a brain science level, even people can go there, and there's been some research that has worked kind of on that level too. But in terms of media studies and communication studies, this would be media uses and effects, that aspect of it where you would run experiments with communication media and see how people actually respond to it. So this has to do with cognition. So you've got the historical empirical approach on the one side, the cognitive side on the other. And I'm known in part for the theory of the cognitive container, which I might talk about a little bit more in detail later. But the idea of news media then shifting, at least in the online form, toward a more contained sort of app-like environment where we're not just scattered out onto the web via all of these distracting links onto the internet, but instead embedded media then are included in multimedia features that usually scroll vertically or in the space of audio like ours. You don't have a bunch of distracting links, do you? Right, Matt, in today's episode, we don't have a bunch of things that are going to say, oh, here, dear listener, go over there online. We'll just scatter your attention over there with maybe an ad or maybe some other content that might look enticing. So that's what's represented by the cognitive container concept here that I've theorized we've moved toward. So, but back to your original question, though, about really what is communication and how does narrative fit in. We can go all the way back to cave paintings, yes, and infant communication. Okay, cave paintings are the most ancient form that we have on record, right, of humans actually communicating with one another through a medium. Okay. We don't have any audio record of people speaking to one another, but we have a pretty good idea that there was some kind of speech patterns going on at those times. But we do have a physical record, obviously, of those cave paintings. So that's one. And the cave paintings were telling stories, obviously, right? Those were narrative. This is the hunt. This is what took place. And this is going to communicate my experience in it. It's going to carry various cultural meanings, etc. Infant communication, really interesting and important. We're not born hardwired to speak. We're not born hardwired to write either. We have to acquire these skills for communication through media. And we cannot tell stories, therefore, we can't have narrative without acquiring a communicative skill. To acquire the communicative skill, you've got to have a medium. But the whole thought here is that language from newborns, it's a skill that's acquired through the medium of the voice in this case, right? That's the medium. The medium is built into your body now. We don't think of the body as a medium, but it is. Just like a pencil and paper are a medium. And you've got to learn to control that medium in order to communicate. So the key to narrative truly is the acquisition then of communication through this basic form of media. And then writing, once we really do get up to the beyond speaking to the writing level, writing then becomes really what Wilbur Schramm called the tuition for human knowledge. It's the thing that gets us over the hump so that we can amass and collect more sophisticated data than just what we could do verbally, right? Now we're going back to the verbal, interestingly, in the form of the podcast, like today, right? Because we already have the written, right, data stores to lean on. Okay. I mean, in preparation for this conversation today, you sent me a written outline. I have some written notes. Okay. I mean, we lean on writing as a storage kind of component for us to dig into. Then from there, we can tell our stories. But yeah, first words typically from an infant, just like those cave paintings, are going to be stories. They're not going to be, statistical data, right? They're not going to be isolated items. They're going to be woven together. A child who's learning to speak first, you're saying, who's Tigger? Tigger's going to be a character, right, that they just heard about, but they're going to situate Tigger in a narrative typically and understand characterization vis-a-vis how Tigger fits into that little tale, right, that has been comprehended cognitively by the child. So that's the most basic building blocks of where we get narrative from and why we're so hardwired to want to tell these stories from day one. And we can go to our ancient ancestors, the cave painters, and then down to an infant to understand why.
You talking about the body as a medium gave me an idea that so we think of people with disabilities as they're losing a medium of communication. That's why it's really okay. They have to move to a different medium, right? They have to communicate. If they're deaf, they have to communicate through visual language. So we have sign language, and I guess those are the two big ones that we see, right? We communicate visually and through audio. So yeah, let's talk about the narrative structure a little bit. Malcolm Gladwell's one of my favorite authors. I think he tells great stories. He talks about the difference between an anecdote and a story as being kind of a subtle difference, but just that there's meaning in a story. And I think he says specifically that a story betrays expectation somehow. It starts one way and ends another. To me, it's kind of obvious if you've heard people tell a meaningless story, but I guess that's what an anecdote is. And then stories, for some reason, they capture us and they have meaning. And I'd like to talk about sort of what goes into it that makes it meaningful to us, right?
I think Gladwell, is onto something by, talking about the difference between the broader story and the anecdote. But I would argue that the anecdote is shot through with meaning if it's well employed, right? So I teach magazine reporting and writing, and my mantra is 3 things you've got to use in those feature stories, and that's action, angle, and anecdotes. And anecdotes are really key, especially that anecdotal lead in any good journalistic long form story, because it grounds you into a situation. It's in media res, as the ancient term goes. That means in the middle of things, right? You're catching your character as something is occurring, right? So I begin my book on the Iowa Writers Workshop. I try to go dial right into an incident that's full of meaning, that's packed with meaning, but that is sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's the lead that's going to draw that reader in, and that anecdote is going to be the linchpin to the broader narrative, right, that I'm going to tell. And so I begin the whole book by saying that, on a drunken night in Iowa City in 1952, a world famous poet laureate reached for his mangled horn-rimmed glasses. Okay. He had just been savagely punched in the face by his own graduate student. Okay. So here's a scenario, here's an event, here's something, but we're coming right in the middle of it. Shakespeare starts almost every play this way. First thing you're going to see in a Shakespeare play is people running around madly on stage, usually some kind of a chase, someone screaming at someone else. How about James Bond movies, right? You're going to see some kind of action that pulls you in. You go, oh my God, who's chasing who? What the hell is happening, right? But the idea is that anecdote, that little mini story that sets you up, again, that's going to set the blueprint for the entire broader spectrum. I mean, I can remember, Matt, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was working on my master's degree, the comprehensive exam asked us to take the opening page of, I think it was Moby Dick, and just say, okay, how is the entire narrative written into that first page? Go. That's a tall order. But still, that's getting at the same idea that at the very tiniest level of a story, that's all an anecdote is, a micro story, right? You've got the entire narrative etched into it, right? Packed in some kind of, like you're saying, like you mentioned before, implicit way. And it's up to the reader then to think about how that can be unpacked and played out. That's where really the intrigue of reading comes from. And if something is if that narrative is well crafted, it's going to leverage those anecdotes to do that kind of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So about the anecdote, it does have meaning with more context than it would, and with everything, it can depend on the audience. It can depend on how the information is taken, whether it's meaningful or not.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotes stripped from the bigger narrative, it can be rendered totally meaningless. A, but B, it can also be used for things other than what it really meant, right, in the bigger picture from where that event occurred. And this is where, disinformation and manipulation can come into play. Things can get scary pretty quickly, and yeah, that's where that anecdote alone as a standalone thing can become relatively meaningless. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to focusing a little bit on hero stories, if you don't mind. I think they're maybe the most ubiquitous media that everyone's familiar with. They dominate culture now, and I just want to talk about like why they're a story, what's in there that everyone finds so captivating, and I guess what's the intent of telling a story through the form of a hero story?
Absolutely. So, Joseph Campbell, I think had theorized about the heroic journey, right, is this archetypical story that's been told from the Homeric period up to the present day. And, he was right. And he applied a lot of his analysis to the Star Wars franchise and all of the films, et cetera, that have come out of that. And really just made some fascinating connections between these sort of archetypical patterns. And the point's well taken. Those patterns have been there. But it's the variation on those patterns that make things interesting, right? We don't want the same stories told to us again and again. We can see the same basic patterns showing up, but the twists on them are really infinite. I mean, which is evidenced by the fact that the movie industry right now is so dominated by superhero films, right? I mean, we get an endless stream of them, and a lot of people lament that and say, "Oh, storytelling's dead," et cetera. Well, but the other side of the coin is that, we've really seen almost like an infinite number of possibilities coming out of what people originally thought were just sort of a limited set of characters and situations, and we're just seeing that proliferate now in ways that nobody really anticipated before. So I think those archetypes are there. I think people are attracted to them for a variety of reasons. A lot of them are psychological. People want to attach themselves to some sort of character that has a capacity to do something that they don't. And this is sort of the Walter Mitty kind of fantasy, that a lot of people will want to sort of transport themselves into another identity and feel that sense of power, whether it's vigilante justice, going back all the way to the Batman. Actually, radio is where Batman started, with the Shadow, right? And then that gets picked up into comics, and then that gets turned into the film industry and TV, et cetera, and then that gets transmediated. But the thought is that there is an impact into these things, cultural meanings, right? Cultural desires. It's not just that, these narratives get created out of thin air. There's a theory called social construction of technology, SCOTS, SCOTS. And what that postulates is that the people choose intentionally these narratives because they serve some sort of cultural purpose. And in a lot of ways, you go back to the Batman one, and there's a frustration with the law being inadequate and the justice system being inadequate to keep proper order in society, and too many people getting away with organized crime, et cetera. And the one that's going to crack that, break that barrier, is somebody who's not a cop. Batman is not a cop. The Shadow is not a police officer, has not been trained, does not wear a badge or anything, yet brings justice and order better than anybody else.
Yeah, so I want to draw an analogy because I think part of the reason we need these familiar stories is we need something familiar about the narrative in order to lay on top of more information then. So I'm going to draw an analogy to like music. If you start listening to a new genre, if let's say, I don't know, an extreme example would be like metal or something. If you're trying to get somebody to understand that new genre, you don't throw them in the deep end with like the most hardcore, this is just a totally unfamiliar sound. They don't know what's going on. They don't understand it. But if you kind of ease them on with maybe some more popular ones, and then like it's something familiar, and then you can kind of understand the genre more, kind of understand what's going on more. And I feel like you can draw that analogy to movies and that sort of thing too, where you need some familiarity with the content in order to learn anything. Because if you just throw in like watching movies when I was young, you watch some movie that's just totally new to you, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
The superhero stuff makes sense, and you can introduce new ideas, new philosophy, new characters and things on top of that structure, and that's how we learn things, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. I think genres and signature styles of both fictional content, but also of nonfiction content, of journalistic storytelling, it has to have that kind of level of entry. That the bar has to be low enough for everybody to be able to come in and then learn, right? And then basically explore and be transported into that story space without too much friction. The idea is that you don't want to put up too much of a wall against people wanting to come in. And I think then the function and the impact of the narrative is going to be bigger. And then the capacity to then bend the genre, right, actually happens when you get people in that space. Then you can start to really move and say, okay, this convention we're going to play with here, right? And just think of things like narrative journalism, for example, with making its narrative turn probably around 2010 or so, after we had really truncated headline driven news, in the 2000 to 2010. From about 2010 on, you can go online then and suddenly find really immersive storytelling, right? deep and kind of very textured and long form kind of storytelling, and truly you didn't really find that before. And so I think what we're getting now is really a deeper connection to readers, and realization that the human brain is not a fact memorizing machine, but it's something that's going to want to crave those big stories. And the longer and the more fiction like those stories are for the journalist side, the better. I mean, the bigger impact that you can have on the reader. And truly, this doesn't happen kind of out of thin air. We have Tom Wolfe with the New Journalism, for example, in the 1960s and 70s. And that comes out because it's prompted by the journalists who want to really free themselves from the narrowness of objective journalism. And they want to be able to tell stories now, like fiction stories, right? Like very cinematic stories, like these, right, tales that we're talking about right now, superhero stories, etc. But as nonfiction, right? So The Right Stuff, by Tom Wolfe, which is about the space program, et cetera. These are stories that have sort of gone on kind of as lore, as legend, but in fact, they're based on complete hardcore reporting and interviewing and fact finding, and it works as journalism, but it also works as narrative, and the two can absolutely be kind of superimposed and immersive as well. And then we have of course, undercover journalism, where folks can go actually undercover, maybe into a private prison, like Shane Bauer did for Mother Jones, the publication. And he spent 4 months, working as a prison guard in a private prison. And, whoa, are you going to see some stuff? Are you going to have some stories to tell? Well, yeah, because you just saw like a lot of the inside of a very, very corrupt and brutal system. And it's definitely, the onus is on you to make that story pop. And it is, yeah, it's a page turner, I mean, it reads like a novel is the idea. And that's what Tom Wolfe's original vision was, is that, we could have something like a nonfiction novel.
Mhm. So something like that, probably you have a lot of anecdotes, and then the real skill is to bring it together into a narrative to give some meaning to all those anecdotes, right? And the news too. I was curious, since you brought that up. I never watched the news very much until there was more like news commentary, like people who could contextualize it and put their perspective onto the news and give it meaning, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly really what has occurred. We get really this kind of almost, I almost describe it in some of my work as a renaissance of journalistic storytelling, mainly due to digital taking up the. And I'll put it this way: digital steps up to the plate and answers the question to all of those people who were fearing that we were in a state of narrative deprivation. Okay. And this was in the early 2000s. I remember it really well. Like, oh my God, no one's reading anymore. Oh my God, the internet is going to kill narrative. Like, right? We're done with narrative because headline driven news is so truncated, it's so short, it's so brief, and people's attention is shrinking more and more. And the studies are showing, oh yeah, attention span is not only 7 minutes, it's like 30 seconds now, right? And everybody's blaming video games, and right, you just blame anything in pop culture now, and now you're seeing, well, we've lost narrative as we know it. And narrative is the connection to our deepest connection to our humanity. And so, wow, we're going to hell in a handbasket, right? And so, yet that was like the early 2000s. I think there was a point to be made there, and a lot of folks were very concerned. And then around 2000 or so, suddenly a lot of news organizations have started to say, hey, we can tell long stories, right? And people won't go away. Right. A lot of it was, oh, that's boring, right? The longer it is, the more boring it is. Well, hold on. There's something called the deep dive in journalism, and that can be a captivating ride if you do it right. And if you do it through the medium, right, that's going to really capture people's attention and draw them in. And that's where we get the New York Times with Snowfall, this story about a bunch of skiers in the backcountry of Northwest Washington who got caught in an avalanche, and a couple of them died. Anyway, it's a multimedia feature that the New York Times put out. It's very cinematic. It has incredible embedded videos, but it has text also that reads perfectly integrated, right, with the video. And so that was the pivot that happened around, and that was 2012. And then in 2014, we get serial. So audio is going with the deep dive, told in chapters, again, like a novel. And suddenly people's appetite for narrative is stoked again. And guess what? We're binge watching stuff on Netflix then too, right? Aren't we? And documentary content on that. I mean, right? People start binge watching documentaries. It's like, hold on, when has that ever happened? Okay. And I would argue maybe that it did happen maybe in the 1990s, right? With the Ken Burns documentaries, right? The Civil War, et cetera, those PBS docs that came out then. Very immersive, very long form, and people bought them. They couldn't really binge watch them because they weren't digitally released in full seasons, but they were released in packages of DVDs, and so you could technically just binge watch. And I don't know if a lot of folks did Ken Burns videos, et cetera. But the thought is that now documentary binge watching it's just a common thing. Yeah, I think we do have people going deeper now than ever. We don't really have narrative deprivation anymore, thankfully. And the news media is now realizing that with narrative storytelling, we have just the capacity then to create more empathy with readers, right? Change issue attitudes, cognitive responses, and perceived credibility. All of those are going to be enhanced then with narrative storytelling compared to non-narrative. And by non-narrative, I mean the inverted pyramid, which is going to be the basic information up front, and then the who, what, when, why, where, and then bang, 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 just like your typical traditional non-narrative stories. So the narrative ones, though, people can retain the information, they can retrieve it. They're more moved by it. Their attitudes and their behaviors are affected more deeply by it. It's the game changer, and I think that people like Nicholas Carr, who was a Boulder guy, as a matter of fact, he lived up in Pembroke Hills for a long time. I think he might still, but he wrote a book called The Shallows, and he was really just doomsday kind of about, hey, we're that internet, right, that we're on all the time has put us off into a cognitive strain of existence that is so distracting. It's so deeply antithetical to what he calls deep reading or literary reading, which is the kind of thing we're talking about, which is narrativity that's long, that we're losing our capacity to really be sophisticated thinkers, and it's dumbing down humanity, and our brains are going to show it. And he goes into some brain science to try to prove that. And it's called The Shallows, his book is. And so I've written an article countering that and saying that, we've actually moved beyond the shallows, and even things like Twitter can actually foster intellectual culture, right? By virtue of having maybe reading groups about David Foster Wallace's novels, incredibly sophisticated content, but it's a Twitter group, okay? So the medium is not dumbing down Wallace. It's actually fostering deeper understanding of Wallace, because people aren't going to just stay on that medium. They're going to use it, right, as a way to then plunge into deeper waters, so to speak, if you use the metaphor of the deep sea diver, and go down below, as opposed to what Carr says, which is to stay on the surface like some jet skier manically zipping around, without really stopping and focusing on one thing very deeply. So yeah, I think Carr needs to be revised. You know what I mean? I think he had a point though from the early 2000s, but I think we've got media now. And again, one can look at streaming video, one can look at long form podcasts, like the one we're doing right now, and deep dives, which really have the bigger impact on audiences.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely the opportunity to go deep, and then but you do also see people getting stuck on the jet ski and just zipping around everywhere, right? And so
For
it is
sure.
a problem, but it's a fixable problem. It's not a problem with the media per se, but just the way we interact and engage with it.
Yeah.
So that's a good segue into how we use media, and how the stories we tell really depend on the medium itself. I remember James Cameron talking about creating Avatar, that he had this idea for the story for like 30 years or something, but he didn't have a good way to tell it because the cinematography, the technology wasn't there yet. And then suddenly he has motion capture and
Yeah.
he can tell the story he wants, and it becomes the biggest movie of the time. And we see that with, you were talking about the digital stuff, that we can now create these long form things with streaming, because before people would only watch a show, it would be on at a certain time, they can only catch it maybe for a half an hour or so, like they had to be there at the right time. And now people can watch it on their own time, and so we have all new possibilities and all new narratives because we have new ways of telling stories, right?
Okay, yeah, if I can just jump onto that and say, yeah, absolutely. So, your point about the Avatar film, I mean, terrific point, because that was a game changer in terms of media technology really being the key to that entire film. The medium wraps the film truly. I want to say the same is true for the 1619 project, right? In terms of storytelling, that we don't think of slavery as 400 years old until we get it transmediated to us, right? And not just as a print, I guess, issue of the New York Times Magazine, I think is when it first came out. That's when it first came out. People don't think of the 1619 project that way, It's become a podcast. It's become across the board now a variety of media, including a Hulu series that's been spun off on it. And you're talking about streaming video. There we go. So Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the author, the person behind the 1619 project, she pivots over to Hulu, right? And who did she grab to produce that Hulu project but a guy named Roger Ross Williams? Who's he? He's a guy who did a VR production called Traveling While Black. And it requires that you put on HMD, head mounted display, and go into a virtual reality kind of scenario where you're sitting alongside people at a diner called Ben's Chili Bowl in Washington, D.C., which was a safe haven for people, and really I want to say, headquarters, a command center for the civil rights movement during the 20th century. And you're hearing these people's stories then about what it was like to travel across the United States in the 20th century and early 20th century too, and have to deal with things like sundown laws, right? Where Black people would be lynched or killed or thrown in jail if they were there after sundown. And right, how to avoid that and circumvent that. And you're listening to their stories right here, right now, and you're in that VR space. Wow. So Williams is, you see where we're going with this. Williams is Nicole Hannah-Jones's go-to then for how to produce and make as immersive as possible. They're not going to do VRs, they'll still do streaming video, but to still get a guy who's versed in how to bring people and transport them into a narrative like that through the medium, that's her guy. And she's going to definitely benefit, I think, from that medium. But you can absolutely believe, though, that for her to just stay in print alone with a 1619 project, not going to have the impact. That is aggressively a transmediated story that we have, and has changed the dialogue and the discourse to the point where our discussion today is about narrative. Well, narrative is politics, right? Whose story about what slavery is and how our nation is structured potentially on deep inequalities is what Ron DeSantis is trying to censor out of every textbook in the state of Florida today. And that's what he's running his entire political campaign on, to try to make it to the White House. So competing narratives. I mean, it's just everything. And we can see that, oh boy, January 6th, that follows a narrative, right? Just using that term, January 6th, it's going to evoke a story in your head, depending on what competing narrative you've decided is the accurate one. Okay. And so layers of narratives then are told, and truly you're going to have the election deniers, the Stop the Steal folks saying, well, you know what, I have my story, that those guys are the true patriots, and this is what people who were sort of the legacy of Rush Limbaugh, online in terms of podcast journalism from the far right were saying, hey, these people were patriots. And then the other competing narrative was saying, well, they're criminals. And a lot of them have been thrown in jail. So our criminal justice system has spoken about that, but the thought is that, competing narratives in politics and media then are constantly, aren't they, at this braided together intersection that's really fraught with a desire for control.
Yeah, I want to go back to, you talked about the immersion. I want to focus on that a little bit, because that's dependent, to me, it seems like, both on the story itself and the media, because you can get immersed in a book, definitely. Like, you can get into that flow state. I know you like to talk about like the ones where they take up even more of your senses. Maybe you're interacting, maybe it's like, as virtual reality type stuff, and that's even more of your senses built in. But is it just getting to that flow state, and then at the same time, maybe are different media more challenging to get into that state or not? I can imagine, like, there's lots of boring writing out there, but if you have an action movie, like most people, it's pretty straightforward to get somebody immersed.
It's sort of like baking or something, it's like, well, that sugar tastes good. So if we just use sugar and whatever kind of ingredients and whatever method, we're going to be good to go. I'll tell you what, no, right? It's not going to work. It has to be incredibly carefully orchestrated and done so with an eye toward, and especially if that immersive content is journalistic, an eye toward really two types that you could get into. And you're engaging in this too with your very podcast that you're working here. One would be ethnographic realism, right? On the one hand, that's more objective. It has an omniscient narrator. You've got techniques associated with social realism. On the other side, you have something called cultural phenomenology. And that's the kind of stuff you're up to here with your podcast. And a lot of the 1619 Project does this too, but it does it through anecdote too, right? Nicole Hannah-Jones is going to tell a ton of anecdotes, stories about her ancestors, and of course about sharecroppers and other folks who are not related to her, to tell that story of the long view of where slavery comes from. But cultural phenomenology is going to be more subjective. It's going to be about reflection, exploration, and personalization. And truly, when you see those two options in front of you, there's a continuum then between kind of the more objective, pure objectivity being impossible, but the more objective, and then the more subjective. And then I think when you get down to immersive media, really there is just wonderful study called the digital animation of journalism, where people were taken as, I think there were a series of probably about 50 plus experimental subjects who were given eye tracking devices to put on. And then they had to basically, they were told to read a bunch of multimedia features, and the eye tracking then would keep track of where their eyes would go. And so obviously people are thinking, well, no one's going to read the text. Everybody's going to go to the pictures. Everybody's going to go to the video and just sit there. Nobody's going to want to read. Actually, what they found was really interesting is that photo was appreciated by these users as much as the well-written text. And that even though the assumption was, oh, nobody's going to read the text, people did read the text. And they read it in conjunction with the really high quality, what they considered high quality photojournalism. But what they didn't like was really interesting, was the video, because a lot of embedded video and multimedia features that scroll vertically that are embedded in these stories are pretty crappy, okay? they're pretty badly edited. They're usually very quick, and they're done with the thought that, oh, everybody loves videos, so let's just chuck in a video. Just like I said about cooking and sugar, right? I just think sugar's your go-to and you just can do anything with it. You're wrong, and same thing. Video is not always created equally. It's got to be edited very carefully. But that study was really pretty key. And I think it showed that scene, dramatic tension, characterization, dialogue are really expressed not only in the text, but in other media such as videos, animations, audio fragments. We have photo slideshows. And when they're embedded, these things then enhance the storytelling. When they're not embedded, when they're linked out onto the internet, this is my theory of the cognitive container. The cognitive container then is broken, right? We don't have that sealed bubble where our attention is focused. We're now going down the rabbit hole that is called the World Wide Web, and you just have tons of links. And guess what? Google is now owning you, right? Because they've got some ads that they're going to kick in, and then you just, well, you're gone. You're out. You're somewhere else, right? Your cognition has just exited the building. Elvis has left the building, as they say. So when it's contained, though, we can hit this incredibly high level of storytelling. I mean, we started this conversation by saying, how basic storytelling, cave painting, speaking, writing is such an important communicator of data, but of human experience that can also be entertaining. But hey, when you make that interactive now and digital and immersive, all of those levels of what we talked about before, empathy, right? Issue and attitudes being affected, cognitive responses being affected, and then perceived credibility, all of that is going to increase with interactivity and with the digital interface here, from 3D video to VR and gamification, something, right, that we haven't talked about yet, but when stories can be told through video games and as something that can be considered interactive in the way of, hey, you can pick your own story now, right?
Yeah, I want to get there pretty soon, actually. I just want to do one more on memory, because we talked about empathy and all these things. How do different media influence the way we remember things? You hear about making stories sticky, making them memorable, right? And also, we're very good at remembering images and less good at remembering language. I think I saw a study that talked about that. And even there's these people who do like memory contests, and if you want to remember language, you have to convert it to something visual in your head. And so so visual is really like the stuff of memory, I think.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. And so that's where, digital media comes in and really saves the day from our narrative deprivation, right? Is that yeah, we can have embedded video or embedded photojournalism, and then graphic animated maps that move upon scrolling automatically, and they can, that's literally bringing the narrative to life before your eyes. And that's just the visual component. Look, we're just talking right now. A lot of people are going to be hearing, not seeing us. And any other well-done podcast is going to have that kind of immersive thing, but with no visuals at all whatsoever. So that's a game changer too, right? Is that, the first inclination is that, yeah, for any kind of narrative transportation, you've got to have a visual. But language can also, especially when spoken and with the intimacy of the human voice, can bring people places, right? And that's where if our words are just text alone, like if you're trying to just make a transcript of this podcast and put that up online, do you think a lot of people are going to visit and enjoy that? And not even, like we're embodied insofar as, even though we're disembodied insofar as our voices animate us. And so that's kind of the magic of where we can kind of jump the screen altogether, you know what I mean? Through the audio medium. But you're absolutely dead right, is that the immersive turn in storytelling, from 2010 on, really has a longer history of the use of the visual to bring people, to transport them into narratives. And I'm going to want to say that you've got a couple of examples. One is the sketchbook by Washington Irving, right? He was our first professional author in about 1820. And he basically goes back to England. And a lot of people, England and America aren't getting along well in 1820, right? We've had the War of 1814. We had the American Revolution. We don't like the Brits, okay? They don't like us. And yet he tries to build a bridge diplomatically by going abroad. He keeps a record then of his travels in England and goes to all of the sites, the familiar sites, and also visits people and villagers, etc., as well as dignitaries. But he keeps sketches. That's why he calls it a sketchbook, so that people can actually see also what his word pictures are telling. So word pictures, right? So the visual, right, that comes through language is then reinforced with the image there. And guess what? They get a completely different, they meaning the Brits, get a completely different picture of us as Americans. They think we're barbarians, okay? At that point, just devoid of culture, incapable of any kind of civility, manners, or gentility. And they witness him, Washington Irving, and they go, no, actually, that's an American gentleman. My gosh, it's possible. And so bridges are built then in terms of diplomatic respect to really reconcile post-war between us and Great Britain at that point. And then I think we go forward to the power of the image. And my goodness, I mean, Matt, George Floyd, right? I mean, seeing is believing. And who takes that image? Who takes that video? It's a teenager, right? She actually hands it over to TMZ of all places, right? But that's how media is today. And it doesn't matter that sits on TMZ first. Everybody's going to get it later. Then it transmediates through social media. People who are, willing to contextualize it then, like Unicorn Riot, they're a nonprofit outlet that covered the Black Lives Matter protests better than anybody else, according to the New York Times and a lot of places. Mainly because seeing is believing. Again, they used open kind of feed, a live video of all of those protests in Minneapolis, and let people just see for themselves what was going on, in addition to handing the mic over to citizens in the neighborhood. First time that those folks really ever had a voice. And so, again, highly visual, transporting that viewer right to the protest moment. I mean, you're seeing that reporter with the camera on the shoulder going, my God, my eyes are, right, fried right now because of this tear gas, right? Their pepper spray coming out or whatever. I'm exhausted. My legs are cramping up. I've been on my feet now for, 10 hours or whatever. It's the kind of thing where you really do enter that moment. And again, you can trace that back to somebody like Washington Irving. And that would be the concept there in media studies called presence or narrative transportation. And again, the live streaming video of the Black Lives Matter protests are big there. But I just want to say, though, that in response to your question about visual, narrative articles that are put alongside non-narrative articles, and especially ones that are visually narrated, cinematic, I guess you would call that, they absolutely stimulate more comprehension, retention, and recognition of that information provided. And we have studies, there's a lot of research that proves this. Not only nonfiction narrative, but fictional narrative. I just got back from the University of Paris, where I delivered a keynote on the future of technological mediation of journalism and media. And fascinatingly, the Notre Dame Cathedral would not have existed at all. Would have been taken down in the early 19th century were it not for Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which he published as a novel. And suddenly people saw the value of this structure. They at first thought it was ugly. They thought it was too coarse and barbaric and very Gothic and kind of brooding, right? The novel came out, the novel became wildly popular, and they valued it. So, I mean, there's a narrative, right, with a real civic outcome. And that narrative is not even, it's not even nonfiction, it's fiction, right? Yet it has that same kind of impact. I think we see Uncle Tom's Cabin do the same thing for the abolitionist movement, right, in the 19th century. Here in America, if Harry Beecher Stowe doesn't write this novel, people in the North really aren't going to care as deeply because it doesn't put a human face on the issue of slavery as much. And, Abraham Lincoln is going to say to Harry Beecher Stowe, oh, so you're the little lady who started this great big war,
Yeah.
She's a novelist. She's a storyteller, So, I mean, stories are profound in this sense. We, yeah. And in addition to which, Ida B. Wells, right, who is the great journalist who reported on lynching in the late 20th, or I'm sorry, the late 19th, early 20th century in the Deep South, all reporting about lynchings at that time, lynchings of Black people, were statistical, and they were usually faceless aggregate kind of statistics that they just kind of data dumped. And she jumped in and put really felt detail and a human face on each of these events, gave it a tick-tock kind of narrative, just a point blow by blow. This is what happened here, and scene setting, right? Atmosphere, character, etc. Telling those as narratives, suddenly, wow, it makes the difference. And to the extent that the white supremacists in the South caught hold of her work and said, okay, we're going to burn your newspaper office down. They did. She had to flee to the North and set up shop up there. But yeah, do narratives matter? Do the visuals matter? And I would argue that, even somebody like Wells, Ida B. Wells, even though she's not putting images, she doesn't have a photojournalist with her while she's reporting on these lynchings, right? She doesn't have a videographer with her. It's just her words, but I'm telling you, the words are painting pictures. The words are cinematic in the sense that they really roll the film, so to speak, of an actual event that's happening, as opposed to kind of giving you an abstract, statistical, boring look at it. The more engaging those stories are, the more political they are right now. And I mean, you can go to the picture of Emmett Till's mangled body too on the cover of Jet magazine, and how that gets pumped out through the Black press, and that's a game changer too. In the mid 20th century, this teenage boy is killed savagely in the Deep South, and the mother refuses to have a covered casket, and refuses to keep the picture of his mangled body from the public eye. And she wants people to see, as she said, I want them to see what they did to my baby, 14-year-old boy. So yeah, the visual, oh my goodness, yeah. But don't sleep on the text as a conduit, as something that can carry that visual forward, like Irving really showed could be done too in the early days.
Okay, great. I think that's probably the end of the story. That sounds like a good way to wrap it up. I do want to go back and collect a few tangential things that I think might be interesting to add on to. So video games. I know you talked about video games, and that's sort of the new emerging media. And I'm not a huge video game person, but I think they're super interesting because they're often downplayed as not sophisticated, maybe. I feel like it was the same way TV was before we started getting awesome TV shows and really good narratives. And now I feel like it's the same with video games, where there's such opportunity there to create these immersive and interactive media, and so much potential for storytelling there. And I looked at, well, not just potential, it's already realized as far as I can tell. The top video games are an order of magnitude more than the top movies in terms of revenue. So like, it's already there, I guess. Could you talk about why video games are so good, but also where you see them heading? Because I know you really focus a lot on that as a medium for communication, not just storytelling and playing games, because it's so much more than that, really.
Exactly. So just like any medium, if it's all about affordance, right? So going back to kind of how infants begin to communicate, right? They start to realize that they can modulate their voices, that they can control air through their vocal cords and create different sounds, whether they're vowels or consonant sounds or whatever. And they can communicate with their eyes and their faces. And once that realization is made, that affordance of that, right, part of their bodies then gets leveraged in a certain way. And it's all about leveraging a medium for a particular effect. And so if video games then are only used for escapist first-person shooter entertainment, period, and it's all going to be highly fantasy oriented, fictional, escapist, right? Just nothing to do with the real world, then we're pigeonholed, aren't we? We don't see any of the potential then for that medium, maybe creating an opportunity for civic engagement, maybe saying something about history, maybe saying something about the real world that we live in here, and not just sort of through kind of implicit values that are baked into the fiction. But once we unleash that medium that is so absolutely influential to the point where, I mean, there's serious concern about how influential video games really are, right? I mean, video game addiction, how about connection to the shooting, right? Shootings, public mass shootings that occur from Columbine forward, right? We can see that kind of connection, the valorization of violence, the desensitization to violence, et cetera. You know, the notion that, yeah, guns are just play, and let's extend that out into reality and take our aggressions out and our toxic masculinity out on the world, et cetera. So I mean, there's been a lot of denigration, and a lot of it accurate too, of the medium of video games. Okay, granted. Yet what happens then in the news media is we get this interesting pivot that happens around, yeah, here it is 2010 again, or like 2008, 2010. News publications start to just say, hey, let's try some quizzes, so that they're not just reading and clicking, but they're actually forced to make decisions, right, as they go through a sequence. And let's maybe try to pack into that some news content. And so it all begins there with just the most rudimentary thing of those news quizzes. And we also get things like editorials that come out that are gamified about 9/11, for example, going all the way back into the early 2000s. And then from there, it becomes more sophisticated and deeper as we go forward. We then see video game developers and startup companies who never really were associated really at all with news journalism or nonfiction, suddenly acting like documentary journalists, right? Going out into the field and interviewing people in Chicago, for example, in Englewood, which is a neighborhood where it has one of the highest crime and murder rates in the nation, okay? The makers of this one game called We Are Chicago goes into then this neighborhood of Englewood, interviews the local citizens, the folks there on the street, and uses their language and even their voices in the game itself, okay, to then put you into this, and you talk about immersion, put you into the role of a young man who is trying to grow up in that environment, okay, and who is trying to protect his little sister as he's going to school, okay. I mean, it's unbelievable. What it does though is it forces you to make decisions then in each scenario based on dialogue boxes. You have different choices for your responses to different issues that you confront. You know, whether it's being harassed by a gang member, or you're working a really boring fast food job as this character, and then somebody comes in with a gun, and now what do? It is the kind of thing that, Michael Block, the guy who produced it, was asked, hey, this is really confusing. No one knows whether this is a video game or a documentary or maybe just straight news. Like, what is this? And he said, I know I've succeeded when you can't figure it out. Okay. I know I have done my job because I've broken down those artificial boundaries between these media. And this was my point about beginning my answer to your question by saying video games are pigeonholed as toxic, escapist, hypermasculine first-person shooters. And now in a game like We Are Chicago, it's actually journalism about people right there in that community. And it's advocacy journalism too. So games like that are profound. There's also Revolution 1979, which is about the Islamic Revolution. It's made by a guy from Iran who is named Naveen Konsari. He was the former cinematic director for GTA, the Grand Theft Auto franchise. And you think,
That's a big
wow,
one.
but that's toxic masculinity. That's escapism. Of course it is, right? Gleeful anarchy, all of that. But guess what? You take his skill set and then you put him onto a documentary project, right? That's about the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And he's interviewing his ancestors and he's getting archival video from the 1979 Islamic revolution to be baked into and unlocked with gameplay in that game. Oh man, right? You've got something a lot better than a 90-minute documentary film, because I can play that documentary film now as in the role of a photojournalist. So we do have this kind of really exciting moment. And yeah, of course, it can be leveraged by people with terrible intentions, just like any media can. I mean, our podcast medium that we're on right now, I'll tell you what, I wrote an article about far right wing podcasters in the January 6th insurrection, connecting the two. And there's a direct link between the two, and it has to do with Rush Limbaugh and his legacy coming forward, and then the exhortation to basically be patriots. And if you're gonna be a real patriot, then you better step up and basically raid the Capitol at that point. So anyway, but yeah, it can all be used badly, all of these media technologies. But my research is to find the bright spots, find where people are making progress, find where people are doing incredibly imaginative things with new digital media that are not just entertaining, maybe they are, but also, socially and politically progressive, making the world a better place. So it can happen, and it does happen, and people who don't recognize it, they just haven't looked hard enough. Those bright spots are there. You just have to look. And I've dedicated a lot of my career to really, pounding the pavement to find these folks and then analyze what they're doing, break it down in terms of production practice and aesthetics. And like I say, your pod is part of this, because I do that for science journalism. When I talk about that in that one chapter of my podcast book, trying to just shed light on some of the best that's out there. Solvable is a great podcast. You talk about Malcolm Gladwell. He owns Pushkin Industries, of course, which puts out a whole series of wonderful pods. Solvable is just ridiculously good. Okay. This is journalism that is solutions journalism. You just don't have hand wringing. Oh, look at all the people who died on that plane crash, or here's another, pandemic strain that's come up or whatever. You're in a medium that's absolutely, as I mentioned before we even started, it's moving the needle and growing intellectual discourse about topics people never really spoke deeply about in mainstream media ever in media history, like period. And that includes race too. And I've written an article about Black podcasting, and people haven't had deep discussions about Blackness in the United States here in mainstream media. I mean, really at all, and except for in the last, I want to say 10 plus years. I mean, it's really a new thing that we can leverage this medium then to do the opposite of what Nick Carr said we were doing, which is making ourselves dumber by being online. I think we're making ourselves smarter. So that's my optimistic spin on things there.
Yeah, no, I'm more or less share that. I think there's a good opportunity to explore with the new media as well. That's sort of a fundamental way that we learn things. We don't just like being told things. We like to go out and push on things and explore for ourselves. And that's what the interactive media, video games can do, but also like all these other social media type stuff where we get to go out, test our ideas, talk to people a lot, and it's just constant back and forth and lots of testing and creating ideas that way. So that's what I really like about media, and the new media, I should say, so that it's super interactive and you get lots of feedback super quick. I did want to get to the funding mechanisms. Basically, my idea was just that, like, obviously ads are People don't like them. They steal your attention. They're kind of manipulative sometimes.
Right.
But on the other hand, they create a super frictionless media landscape. Like if you want to create articles and things like that everyone has easy access to, it probably has to be advertising, right? At least the other models that I see, like New York Times, where you have to pay for it, you kind of get stuck there. So that was just sort of my initial thoughts.
In terms of online ads, there's really a fascinating kind of evolution that's occurred. And what's happened is that display ads, pop-ups, and banners were just the thing, right? From about 2000 to, again, 2010-ish, right about there. And what has happened, though, is that, those people hated those, right? Everybody was distracted by them. And that was one of the things that Nick Carr was complaining about, is not only all of the links that were going to distract us, but these pop-up ads, right? And the banner ads, they're just like pulling your eyes off of what you should be focusing on. And so truly, I think this desire for more immersive cognitive container, right, was part and parcel of getting rid of those distractions and pushing back against them. So ad blockers came up, right? And people could use ad blockers, and they did use them. And suddenly advertisers started to go, okay, hold on. We can't just think that banner ads and pop-ups are the only way to go. We've got to actually go native, right? And do some native advertising and go into people's social media feeds with posts that are going to say paid post on the top. You've seen those in all of your social media feeds, everybody has. But then in addition to that kind of ad, they're also going to say, well, you know what, let's just make our own media content. So podcasts are huge. I'm Trader Joe's, for example. Okay, so say I'm the owner of Trader Joe's. I'm going to make a Trader Joe's podcast. And guess what? That's going to go top 5 on iTunes. Okay. Not only does it have a lot of listeners, but they're fans of that show. Okay. And I'll tell you what, man, that's an ad. That is a straight up advertisement for Trader Joe's. But there are fans of an ad now because the ad has morphed into real media content. Okay. For better or for worse. And real media content now has in it really pretty solid reporting and writing, okay, about the grocery store industry and about their own business practice and their own business model. Are they ever going to look bad as a brand? No, they're going to look sweet as a brand, right? They're going to look just incredibly engaging. But in addition to which, they're going to give you good deep dive data that's fact checked and that's accurate and that's carefully done about, again, the grocery store industry, their own unique business model, et cetera, and what makes it hum, what makes it so different, et cetera. And so it can be done, right? You can carry kind of journalistic values in an ad space now, amazingly, whereas people really thought of those two things as antithetical, like oil and water, like no way you could actually do that. But the thought is that it really is possible, right, to actually do both, and there are plenty of ads now that don't feel like ads at all, that are actually just media content that a lot of people will approach and think, oh, I'm in a space of media content. I'm thinking also of something called cocaineonomics, okay, which is the economics of the cocaine industry that was run by Pablo Escobar, right, in the, I want to say the 1980s, okay? And all that is a digital long form kind of multimedia feature that's incredibly engaging. There's a little quiz at the bottom, so it is gamified a little bit. And it gives you wonderful, right, insight into the economics of the drug trade, the illegal drug trade, right? It's basically a macroeconomic kind of explainer journalistic piece. And you're thinking, God, this is really good journalism, right? And I'm learning a lot about Pablo Escobar and what happened, et cetera, the smuggling. Well, guess what? That's an ad for Narcos, okay? Because Netflix commissioned the Wall Street Journal to write it, the Journal being the big economic authority for, and you're just suddenly, oh, I'm in the middle of an ad, right? But the point is that ad now just an absolute distraction? Is it really toxic, et cetera? It may not be. It may actually be educating you on macroeconomics of drug trade, but also you see how it can happen, also turning you on to the product which Netflix wants you to consume, which is Narcos. And you might go, maybe I want to watch Narcos now. And so really it can be that it's a win-win, that you get educated from that ad in the way that, and informed in the way that good journalism will educate and inform you, but also, get you to act like a consumer in the way that the right producer wants you to act. They can be done badly, trust me, and they can be done in a really sinister, lowly way by virtue of trying to conceal those advertising functions completely and then trick people into thinking that they're reading editorial content and they're really not. That we know that, and people are very upset about that, and then erodes trust in the media and all of that stuff. But as my typical point is that, hold on, there's actually some people who do it right, and miraculously, like Trader Joe's podcast or Cocainenomics. I think Advertising Age, the publication, came out with an article that said ads have now hit a new Zen storytelling state. And Zen storytelling is this long form storytelling, right? This kind of deep dive storytelling that everybody wants. Starbucks did something called Upstanders, which I talk about in my podcast book. Also, I talk about branded content there. And Upstanders is their series of people in communities who are upstanding people who are doing things to make the community a better place. And you just wondering, how are they selling coffee through that? What? Hold on, the product is coffee, and they're talking about people. Well, guess what? Most of these upstanders are parts of networks of folks who have to get together and collaborate, right? Where are they going to go to do that? They're going to go to a Starbucks. Right? So you see the point. Starbucks being kind of the public meeting place nowadays, that, your town hall or whatever, in the colonial era, or I guess they had coffee shops in the colonial area too, right? That functioned as those kinds of public places where folks could, put their heads together and perform work with some kind of civic outcome. You'll see places like McDonald's or Pepsi or whatever, trot out their own podcasts as well. So I think a lot of brands, have jumped into this space. So anyway, that's my long way of answering your.
That's perfect. That's super
interesting.
interesting.
I think there's cash there. You ask, is there a source of revenue? That people have deep pockets for this sort of stuff. They're willing to do this and invest lots of money this direction. That seems to me the move. You don't see a lot of investment in better or more banner and pop-ups. It's the bottom of the barrel who are going to go to the banner and pop-ups. People who have money are typically going for the bigger, longer stories. So we're just getting smarter, and our stories are getting longer, both as ads and as non-ads. That's really kind of, where my research has led me. And again, not to say that there aren't dark sides. They're there, and I'll be the first one.
The view you painted is kind of terrifying to me, honestly. I see the benefits, but just if you were to objectively explain how the corporations are doing their own media now to advertise, it's oh boy, that's sounds a little scary.
It is. It is. And I guess what it forces us to do is just be more wise in terms of our own media literacy, right? In terms of the digital spaces that we're in. And when we enter the metaverse, and I was just talking about this at the University of Paris with a bunch of folks, and at that conference was the public policy manager for Meta was there at the conference, right? And Meta, of course, is in the process of building the metaverse, along with other companies that are also building the metaverse and creating, those immersive spaces, a lot of which already kind of exist. But the thought is that when you get into these digital spaces in the metaverse, a lot of those will be corporate owned, and they're going to be tracking our eyes. They're going to be tracking our every movement, because we're going to be embodied. Our avatars are going to be embodied in those spaces, and your avatar is you. So they're going to have better data on you as a consumer and as a person who acts in digital space now ever than in media history before. And so if there's an opportunity to maybe be really terrified just you wait, until we get into those spaces that are totally virtual. And it's on its way. And a lot of people say, metaverse is not going to happen because HMDs, this eye mounted displays, nobody wants those. They're ugly, they're clunky, there's too much friction, they make people sick, whatever. But they're changing really fast now. We have Apple Vision Pro just came out. It's incredibly tapered and sleek and better than any other product that's come out. Of course, it's high priced. Show me an early television that wasn't high priced before those became more affordable. Show me an early transistor radio that wasn't expensive. That's how media works, right? The earliest products are always so expensive. Then they produce them to scale so that they can be mass distributed and cheaper. And anyway, it's on its way. And the investments are there. At this conference, I discovered that and shared actually the data that Meta is actually paying and poaching people who produce VR development more than any other company out there. So Meta is aggressively competitive here. But yeah, I think we're definitely in for something interesting with the metaverse. That it'll be pretty wild. So
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know if I can say so confidently it's going to be that iteration of metaverse, but virtual reality and that sort of immersion, and like I've read enough sci-fi to be convinced that this is something that we're heading towards, and it's going to happen some way or another, I think.
I mean, people said that we weren't going to have personal computers, like, oh, that was
right,
impossible
exactly.
or whatever. And then, interestingly, this medium that we're on, totally niche, fringe, like people just opening up a mic and going, and not, structured or organized, or not audience driven, not in a genre. Like you're in a genre, you have your title, you have your brand logo, etc., and you have an audience in mind. That was not happening in the early days of podcasting at all.
Sure.
It's just real slipshod. And then that genre started to develop from there. And now we're really a pretty sophisticated kind of moment in our evolutionary trajectory of this medium, which I'm super excited about. It's a lovely time actually to be in this space. So
yeah, no, you're definitely in the right space for what's happening and what's new, I think. I'm gonna have to listen to this at least once again while I'm editing to go back and learn everything that you talked about, because it was a lot. This was great. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Hey, really enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks for having me.